Have you ever been playing a piece of music and all of a sudden it sounds way different? Well, chances are you encountered something called a modulation. And don't let the word scare you. That's just a fancy term for that you changed keys. And we're going to break it down basically by what a modulation is. So I'm going to go in a little more detail. We got how to spot them in music and examples of the most basic types of modulation. So let's get on to our first topic, which of course is... Okay, modulation is all about changing key. So obviously you can tell that you've been changing key because the piece will change visibly in how many sharps or flats are in it. That's one very basic way to determine if you've modulated or not. And then it also changes when you change key. Not only does it change the sharps or flats you're dealing with, it also changes the tonal center. So what in the world does that mean? Well, let me try to explain here, right? So when you have a piece in the key of C major, a lot of the chords and notes are centered around C, also called the tonic or the root. But when you change key, so if I'm changing from C major to A minor, all of a sudden a lot of the notes are centered around A, meaning that they usually start at around A. So you start on an A chord. You might, change chords, but you almost always head back around to A. So it does change the tonal center. Also, another thing to keep in mind about modulations is that it changes the primary chords and the progressions, which kind of takes me to the next slide here. A quick note on building chords. So there are 8 notes in a scale or a key, and you can build a chord on each note to make each chord. So let me show you. So you have key of C major, and you have 8 notes in this scale. Well, if you stack evenly notes on each note of the scale, you can have chords. And so there are 8 total notes. There are, 7 individual notes. There are 7 individual chords that you can use in a key. And the primary chords are the first chord, the fourth chord, and the fifth chord. So that's like if we're changing key from C major to A minor, all of a sudden our primary chords are different because the scale's different. Now A is number 1, so that's an A chord, and then D is number 4, E is number 5. So it not only changes the tonal center, but also changes the primary chords and the chords that you can generally expect in the piece. All right, let's get on to the next topic. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about how to spot a modulation. I'm going to give you one example. How to spot a modulation is actually pretty simple in most cases. You want to look for actual key signature changes. So if I'm taking a look at this piece right here, the Pathetique Sonata, you see how we're in the key with 3 flats there. And if I remember right, that this piece is in the key of C minor. So you have 3 flats there right in the beginning of the piece or the line there. And by the end of the line, see how those 3 flats are now 3 natural signs? Well, whenever you see that type of thing, you might not be used to it. Whenever you see it, it actually tells you that all of a sudden those 3 flats are erased. And that tells you that, hey, we're in a different key. And so from starting here onward, we're probably either in the key of C major or A minor. We're probably in A minor right here. I'd have to kind of analyze it to tell you further. But, just looking at the key signature, this line has 3 flats, this line doesn't. So clearly there is some kind of key change going on or modulation. Number 2 is you want to look at the chords being used. Again, if you see, for instance, if you're in C major, right, you're going to see a lot of C chords, F chords, and G chords. If you start seeing chords that don't even exist in that key, chances are that you've changed key. Makes sense. And it kind of went along with the primary chords I was talking about earlier. You're going to see a different set of those. Look for also the use of certain accidentals that indicate a harmonic minor. And so I don't confuse you too much, all that means is that if you are in the key of C major, and one thing I want to mention is that for every key signature, there's a major and minor equivalent. So C major, its equivalent is A minor. But a lot of times what they do is they take this next to last note and they sharp it. to make what's called a leading tone. So in the middle of the piece, you're actually going to see this G sharp written as an accidental, meaning it's just written in the middle, in the piece rather than on the key signature. You're going to see that sharp. So if all of a sudden you're playing in C major, and all of a sudden the sound changes, but then you start to see, G sharps as well, that could very well indicate that you've switched from a major key to its relative minor, we call that. I'm not going to get too far into that today, because today, like I said, is a very basic introduction into modulations, which, by the way, let's talk about the next slide, which are the different types of modulations. I'm not going to talk about all these. I'm just going to talk about common chord modulations, the diatonic ones. But there's diatonic common chord, there's alter common chord, deceptive cadence, and harmonic modulation using the major minor seventh chord, and harmonic modulation using the seventh chord, diminished seventh, all those things that you can read about. So if you wanted to look up more about how to do these, you can do that from this slide, or let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make videos on these different types of modulations. But like I said, the whole goal of today is just to introduce you to modulations. Okay, common chord modulation, which is what we're going to talk about right now. The common chord modulation is the most common type of modulation, I think. It's the most basic and easy to understand, which is why we're doing it. And basically what you're doing is whenever you're modulating, you have a beginning key, C major, and then you have a key that you're moving to, say A minor. Well, what the common chord modulation is you want to pick a chord that fits within both of those keys. So like for instance, if you're in C major, the G major chord, which is the fifth chord, belongs in C, but it can also belong in A. So you could actually, if you wanted to, use that as a pivot chord. And then there's also other options as well, since there's a lot of crossover between the notes. The more difference there is in terms of sharps and flats between keys, the less opportunities you will have for common chords, because all three of the notes of the chord have to belong in both keys. So if, say I'm in C major and then I'm modulating to G major, well, I couldn't use a D chord because G has an F sharp in it, so that would break the rule. So you wouldn't be able to use that as a common chord. Let's go into it in a little bit more detail, and let me show you an example. By the way, the chord that you use to pivot or change between both keys is called a pivot chord. So here's our common chord modulation example. We're starting in C major, and we have a C chord. Then we're going to, still in C major, an F chord. Moving into the next measure, we have a G chord. And then what we're doing here is we're going to an E minor chord, which exists in the key of C, but it also exists in the key of G. So we can use that as our pivot chord. And I'll explain the Roman numerals here in a second. And then we're going to A. So after the pivot chord, any point after that, you're now in that new key, unless for some reason we pivot back, which can happen from time to time. So you move to this A, and then you see how this next to last chord is a D major. It has that F sharp in it. And that would be saying, well, that doesn't exist in the key of C. And hey, that's totally fine, because now we're after the pivot chord. You don't even need to think about it. We're actually in the key of G. So actually that D chord fits in it quite well. And then back to G major. So let me explain the Roman numerals. So hopefully you know your Roman numerals, that, I is 1, 2 I's is 2, 3 I's is 3, IV is 4, things like that. So all the Roman numerals are telling you is what number chord it is in the scale. Like I was mentioning earlier, that there are 7 different chords in a scale. This is telling you which chord that they're talking about. So if it's I, they're talking about chord number 1. So if you're in C major, that's C major. They're talking about 4. Well, you go up 4 notes. Let me kind of show you here. Oops. You go up 4 notes. Build a chord there. So there's your F major. So exactly like we talked about before. Now, when you use the pivot, let me show you back to where we were talking about, which wasn't there. So right here, so you see at the E minor chord, right, it says 3. And that's telling you that that E minor chord is the third chord in C major. But underneath it, you see a G, right? Well, that's telling you now we're in G major. And then after that, it says 6. Well, all that's telling you is that that E minor chord, which is the pivot chord, is the 3 chord in C major, but the 6 chord in G major. And then the next chord over, which they didn't really have to give you, it looks like they kind of chose 2 pivot chords here. The A minor, which actually exists in both keys. It's the 6 in C and the 2 in A. And then after that, we're in the key of D major. So you don't need to kind of consider what we're doing in C major. And then you go to G. Okay, so here we're going to write out an example. We are in the key of G major. So I'm going to put the G in the little dots there like we had earlier. So we obviously have our 1 chord here. I gave us the first 2 chords. Then we have a 4 chord, which is just a C chord. So if we're in the key of G, you just go up 4 notes. You build the chord on that note. Now it is an inversion, but don't let that trick you. It's still a C, a major chord. And what we want to do is, for this example, is I want to modulate from G major to D major. So what we need to do is we need to, after this chord, come up with a pivot chord we can use to pivot from G major, and then after that we'll be in D major with 2 sharps, F sharp, which we had before, but then a new sharp, C sharp. So let's take a look at it. So one thing I want to keep in mind is that since the key of D has 2 sharps, F sharp and C sharp right there, I recommend not using a pivot chord that includes a C of any type, because that will conflict, at least with the diatonic chord modulation, common chord, it will conflict between the both keys. So we're going to kind of avoid any chords with the C in there. But, you know, maybe a good one would be something maybe with an F sharp in it and no C's in it. And, you know, that 5 chord, I think, works out really, really well. We have D, F sharp, and A right here. So how about we use that as our pivot chord? So you have, let's see, D, oops. D, F sharp, and A. So that is our, so we have to write this out right now. So that is now our 5 chord in G major. Now the question is what chord is it in D major? Well, it's a D major chord, right? So it's actually going to be a 1. So we got to draw our like little, you know, thing here. I got to designate that we're in D. So then I'm just going to draw a 1 here. So now from this point forward, we're actually in the key a D major, which means we can actually use the C sharp again, since we don't even have to consider the key of G. So let's take a look at maybe what the next chord we want to do, right? So a lot of times our primary chords are D major, G major, and A major. So how about we just go, we use that pattern. We go to a G major next. Okay, so our chord progression altogether is that we're in 1 in G, and then we're going to the 4 chord. Then we're going to the 5 chord in G, which happens to be a D major chord. But now after this, we're actually in D major. So then you're going to go to your 4 chord, and then you go to your 5 chord, which I actually meant to put a sharp right here since we're in D major with 2 sharps. So we have our 5 chord here, back to our 1 chord. I don't know how that happened, but here we go, back to the piano. Oops. Okay, Fuddy Duddy asks, how far can a modulation go? From the root up to question mark. So 4, 5, or 6, or 7, and does it matter if you go to major 7th, or minor, or an augmented or diminished chord? Let me think, let's see if I get this question right. Tim, how far can a modulation go from the root to what number? Oh, okay, so 4, 5, or 6, or 7. I'm not sure if I get that part. The modulation can go as long as it needs to go. You can stay in C major for a long time. and then get up to whatever number chord you really, really want. So long as the chord, at least with a common chord modulation, exists in both keys, you're fine to go. Now, whether the chord is major, minor, diminished, or augmented, it'll never be augmented because none of the chords in the key are like that. All depends on what number of the scale that it is, right? So if you're in C major, the first chord's major, and then minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, major. That pattern of chords is the same throughout all major keys. So it really, really depends. It really depends on what number of the chord that you're going to. So when I go from the 5 chord in C or in G major, which was a D major chord, and I go to, I don't know, maybe the 4, both of those are major because they're major in both of those keys. So the major or minor just depends on what number of the chord that you're on. So 4 will always be major. 6 will always be minor. So hopefully that answered it for you. Still not sure on that first part. Tim, how far can a modulation go? From the root up to what? Question mark. Up to what? I mean, you can modulate on the 7th, so long as both of those exist in both keys. Abdul says, what's modulation? It's changing keys, Abdul. So if you're in the, you're playing something that sounds happy, then all of a sudden, it sounds way different, then chances are you've modulated. But check out the recording when I posted to kind of get the overall scope on modulations. All right, any questions about modulations or anything in general? I'm surprised nobody has many questions about this, but that's okay. All right, so I'm going to move on. All right, just kind of looking through to see if there are any questions I really missed or not. Just about Massachusetts. Let's see. Okay. An important thing in understanding modulations is understanding how to construct chords and chord progressions and things like that. Well, I have a lesson I'm going to post around here just for you. I'm also going to include it in the description as well so you can learn more. If you want to take things to the next level, you like my YouTube lessons and you just want to push forward and learn more to music than ever before, go to pianolessonsontheweb.com where I have over 20 courses I made designed for you, the YouTube student, to learn far more about music, piano, music theory, improvisation, and anything else you need to be a well-rounded musician. So thanks everybody for coming out. This has been Tim from Lessons on the Web. Have a great day, and I'll check you out for the next lesson.